They say the Rideau Canal is a place of reflection. Its waters, dark and rhythmic, have witnessed centuries of Canadian history, carrying the silent weight of a nation's growth. But in the pre-dawn chill of June 30th, 2009, those waters became a mirror reflecting a horror that the human mind struggles to process, a darkness that didn't come from the sky, but from within the heart of a family. Imagine, for a moment, the heavy silence of a summer night in Kingston, Ontario, broken not by the wind, but by the mechanical, rhythmic push of one car against another. Beneath the placid surface of the Kingston Mills locks, a silver Nissan Sentra rested upside down in the silt, holding a secret that would shatter the curated facade of a wealthy, perfect immigrant family. This wasn't a tragedy born of a missed turn, a slick road, or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a cold, clinical execution, a cleansing of 3 daughters and a wife, sacrificed on the altar of a father's archaic, twisted notion of honor. In the world of Muhammad Shafia, love was a transaction of obedience, and purity was a currency worth more than the blood of his own children. As the heavy tow truck slowly hoisted that metallic tomb from the depths, the world began to realize that some cages aren't made of iron and stone. They are built from the rigid, suffocating expectations of a patriarch who viewed his own flesh and blood as property to be discarded once it lost its perceived value. This is the story of the Shafia family, the heavy price of an honor that was never truly honorable, and the 4 voices that were silenced beneath the waves of the Rideau Canal. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To truly understand the chilling resolution of this case, we have to peel back the layers of a family hierarchy that was as rigid as it was deceptive. It begins with the patriarch, Muhammad Shafia. Born in 1951 in Kabul, Afghanistan, Muhammad was a man forged in a culture of absolute male authority and mercantile ambition. By the time he reached adulthood, he wasn't just a businessman. He was a tycoon, a trader who could turn electronics, real estate, and imports into a vast fortune. But in Muhammad's world, wealth was nothing without a legacy, and a legacy required heirs. In 1979, he married his first wife, Rona Amir Muhammad. By all accounts, Rona was a woman of immense grace and traditional devotion. She followed Muhammad across borders, supporting his rise to power. But as the years turned into a decade, a heavy silence fell over their marriage. Rona could not conceive. In the traditional patriarchal circles Muhammad inhabited, this was viewed as a catastrophic failure, a biological debt that Rona could never repay. Instead of compassion, she found herself facing the cold reality of Muhammad's ambition. In 1987, seeking to secure his lineage, Muhammad took a second wife, the much younger, fertile Tuba Muhammad Yahya. This was the first fracture in the family's foundation. In many parts of the world, polygamy is a recognized social structure, but in the Shafia household, it became a tool for psychological warfare. Tuba quickly provided what Rona could not: 7 children in rapid succession. As Tuba's status rose with every birth, Rona was systematically dismantled. She wasn't just the first wife anymore. She was the secret wife, a woman forced to live in the shadows of her own home. When the family moved from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and then to the gleaming artificial luxury of Dubai, Rona was brought along not as a partner, but as a domestic servant, a cousin or a nanny, to hide the illegal nature of Muhammad's bigamy from the modern world. By 1992, the family was settled in Dubai, living a life of immense privilege. Muhammad's business flourished, allowing him to house his family in high-end villas and drive the finest cars. But this wealth was a gilded cage. It was here that the 3 eldest daughters, Zainab, Sahar, and Geeti, began to form their identities under the watchful, predatory eyes of their father and their brother, Hamid. Muhammad didn't see his daughters as developing human beings. He saw them as assets whose value was entirely dependent on their purity. If they were compliant, they were prized. If they were defiled by independent thought, they were liabilities. Zainab, the eldest at 19 by the time they reached Canada, was a girl of fire and spirit. She was the first to realize that the world outside their villa didn't operate on her father's rules. She watched her brother, Hamed, be groomed as the little general, given freedom and authority simply by virtue of his gender, while she was expected to be a ghost. Sahar, 17, was the strategist. She learned to navigate the world through deception, living a double life that required an exhausting amount of energy. She was a bright, promising student with dreams of the medical field, but she knew those dreams were a direct threat to Muhammad's control. And then there was Giti, only 13. She was the most vulnerable, yet the most vocal. She was a child who understood intuitively that the honor her father spoke of was actually a shroud. In 2007, the Shafias made their final move to Montreal, Canada. Muhammad purchased a large, respectable home in the St. Leonard borough, presenting his family as the ultimate immigrant success story. To the neighbors, they were wealthy, religious, and perfectly adjusted. But inside, the Western air was acting as a catalyst for a domestic explosion. The girls saw Canadian women walking freely, choosing their own partners, and pursuing careers. For Zainab, the sight was a revelation. For Muhammad, it was a poison. He began to view his daughter's fascination with Canada as a personal insult, a vile infection that he blamed on the filth of Western culture. He didn't see their desire for education as a path to success. He saw it as a path to prostitution. His language in the home became increasingly violent, fueled by a toxic mix of religious extremism and a fragile ego. He wasn't just a father losing his grip, he was a ruler facing a rebellion. And in the center of this storm was Rona, the auntie who saw everything. She became the girls' only confidant, the only person who understood that the luxury surrounding them was just a distraction from the darkness creeping through the hallways. As 2009 approached, the golden cage was no longer enough to hold the girls back, and Muhammad Shafia decided that if the cage was broken, the inhabitants would have to be destroyed. The union between Muhammad Shafia and Tuba Yahya was never a simple matter of the heart. It was a merger of tradition and strategic acquisition designed to secure a legacy that Muhammad felt was slipping through his fingers. By 1987, Muhammad had already spent a decade married to Rona Amir Muhammad, a woman who had been his companion through the early years of his rise to wealth. But in the cold, mercantile logic that governed Muhammad's soul, Rona was a depreciating asset. She was unable to provide him with children, and in the patriarchal landscape he inhabited, a man without sons is a man without a future. When Tuba entered the picture, she was young, fertile, and understood the assignment perfectly. She wasn't just coming into the home as a second wife, she was coming in as the architect of Muhammad's dynasty. For Rona, the arrival of the younger woman was the beginning of a long, agonizing erasure. The two women lived in a state of forced, suffocating proximity, a domestic arrangement that Muhammad controlled with an iron hand. As the years passed and the family moved from the dusty streets of Kabul to the gleaming, artificial towers of Dubai, the power dynamic crystallized. Tuba provided the children, 7 of them, and with each birth, her status as the true mother grew, while Rona was relegated to the status of a live-in servant, a woman whose only value was her labor. In Dubai, the family lived in a golden cage, a world of immense luxury where every need was met, but every movement was monitored. Muhammad's business empire was thriving, and he used his wealth to build a fortress around his family. It was here, amidst the marble floors and high-walled villas, that the honeymoon phase of their life was defined by a quiet, underlying tension. Tuba was not a victim in this household. She was Muhammad's most trusted lieutenant. She was the one who enforced the rules when Muhammad was away on business, the one who ensured the daughters remained pure and compliant. They were a unified front, a wall of traditional authority that the children were never meant to climb. But the move to Canada in 2007 changed the air they breathed. Montreal was a city of vibrant, unapologetic freedom, and for the Shafia daughters, it was like stepping from a black and white world into a kaleidoscope of color. The first red flags didn't appear as grand gestures of rebellion. They appeared in the small, quiet choices the girls began to make. It started with the way they looked at the world outside their windows, the way they lingered at the school gates, the way they began to question why their brother, Hamed, was allowed to exist in a world of freedom while they were confined to a world of shadows. Zainab, the eldest, was the first to truly test the bars of the cage. At 19, she was a woman grown, and she began to chafe under the 9 p.m. curfews and the constant inspection of her private thoughts. She fell in love, a simple human act that in any other home would be a rite of passage, but in the Shafia home, it was a declaration of war. Mohammed didn't see a daughter finding her path. He saw a stain on his property. He began to suspect her of every Western sin, his mind twisting her desire for a normal life into something vile and prostituted. Sahar, only 17, saw the fallout of Zainab's rebellion and chose a different path, a double life. This was the slow burn of the tragedy, the daily, exhausting effort to hide her true self. She would leave the house in traditional attire, her face a mask of obedience, only to transform the moment she reached the safety of school. She had a secret boyfriend, a secret Facebook account, and a secret dream of becoming a doctor, a dream where she didn't have to look over her shoulder. But in a house of 7 children, secrets have a way of leaking out. Hamed, acting as the little general, became his sister's shadow. He followed them. He checked their browser histories. He was the eyes and ears of a patriarch who was slowly losing his grip on his most prized assets. The relationship between the parents and the daughters had shifted from one of protection to one of predatory observation. The house in Montreal was no longer a home. It was a pressure cooker of resentment and fear. Even Rona, the auntie who had no children of her own, tried to intervene. She saw the girls as her own daughters, the only light in her life of hell. She tried to plead their case to Mohammed, but her voice carried no weight in a house where she had been systematically dehumanized. She began to fear for her own life, writing in her diary about Mohammed's growing volatility and Tuba's cold, calculated cruelty. As the summer of 2009 approached, the tension reached a breaking point. The Western values of freedom and individual rights weren't just outside the door. They were inside the hearts of the children. And for Mohammed Shafia, there was only one way to reclaim his honor. He didn't look for a way to understand his daughters. He looked for a way to erase the filth they had become. The golden cage was about to be replaced by a watery grave, and the people meant to protect them were already scouting the location. The plan for what Mohammed Shafia called a family vacation began to settle into its final, lethal shape in the sweltering heat of late June 2009. It was a 10-person caravan, a grand facade of domestic unity that stretched across hundreds of miles of highway. They traveled in 2 vehicles, the family's black Lexus SUV, the pride of Mohammed's fleet, and a recently purchased, second-hand silver Nissan Sentra. The Nissan had been bought just days before the trip, a detail that would later scream premeditation to investigators. To the outside world, it was just an extra car for a large family. In reality, it was a 4-wheeled coffin. They spent several days in Niagara Falls, acting out the roles of tourists. They took photos. They walked along the boardwalks. They marveled at the rushing water. But beneath the smiles captured in those photographs, a predatory observation was taking place. Mohammed and his eldest son, Hamed, weren't just looking at the falls. They were looking for an opportunity. They were scouring their mobile devices, searching for locations that combined 3 specific elements: deep water, a steep drop-off, and total, unmonitored isolation. The day X of this nightmare was June 30th, 2009. The temperature in Ontario was a stifling 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the air thick and heavy with humidity. As the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows over the landscape, the convoy began its return journey toward Montreal. But Mohammed didn't take the most direct route home. He detoured toward the historic city of Kingston, a place where the earth is scarred by the deep channels of the Rideau Canal. Around 1:30 a.m., the vehicles pulled into the parking lot of the Kingston Motel. The city was asleep, the streets deserted. Mohammed checked the family in, but the arrangement was bizarre for a man of his immense wealth. He rented only 2 small, cramped rooms for 10 people. While the younger children were ushered inside to sleep, a different energy was vibrating between the 3 conspirators. Mohammed, Tuba, and Hamed remained active, their voices low, their movements hurried. They weren't resting for the drive. They were moving into the final phase of their cleansing. Shortly before 2 a.m., the silver Nissan Sentra and the black Lexus pulled out of the motel parking lot, leaving the younger children behind. They headed toward the Kingston Mills Locks, a remote historic site where the canal meets a treacherous drop. The site was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating darkness. There were no streetlights here, only the rhythmic sound of rushing water and the rustle of the trees in the humid breeze. Zainab, Sahar, Giti, and Rona were in the Nissan. They were likely exhausted, their defenses lowered by the long hours on the road. They had been told they were stopping for a break or to look at the locks, but they were actually being positioned. Zainab sat in the driver's seat. Sahar and Giti were in the back. Rona, the woman who had lived a life of hell in Mohammed's shadow, sat beside Zainab. The car was positioned at the very edge of the concrete pier, its nose facing the deep, murky basin of the canal. Forensic reconstruction would later paint a chilling picture of what happened in those final seconds. The Nissan was idling at the lip of the water, but it didn't just roll over. To ensure it went into the deep channel and didn't snag on the edge, it needed a massive, mechanical push. Hamed took the wheel of the heavy Lexus SUV. He backed the vehicle up, lining it up with the smaller car like a professional executioner. He accelerated. The sound of the Lexus engine roared through the silent woods. The heavy SUV slammed into the rear of the Nissan Sentra with calculated force. The victims inside likely had only a split second of realization, a terrifying jolt of impact before the car was shoved forward. The Nissan's back bumper crumpled, and the car teetered for a heartbeat on the precipice before it tipped. It plunged nose first into the black water of the canal. As it hit the surface, the weight of the engine caused it to flip, the vehicle settling upside down on the silty bottom, 15 feet below the surface. Inside the cabin, the darkness was absolute. The windows were rolled up, the doors were locked, and as the cold water rushed in through the vents and gaps, there was no escape. They were trapped in a pitch-black, watery tomb. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass from the inside. It is believed they were either unconscious from the impact or simply overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of the canal. In the silence of the Kingston night, 4 lives were extinguished in minutes. But the conspirators had been clumsy. The collision had shattered the Lexus's headlight and grille, leaving small, jagged fragments of black plastic scattered across the concrete pier like dark, accusatory confetti. Hamed and Mohammed, in their haste to leave the scene of the cleansing, missed them. They drove the damaged Lexus back to the motel, its front end mangled from the honor they had just upheld. By 7 a.m. the next morning, Mohammed Shafia walked into the Kingston police station. He wore a practiced look of confusion and frustration. He told the officers that his daughters and his cousin had taken the Nissan for a joyride and hadn't returned. He claimed they were rebellious and likely got lost. As he spoke, he was already weaving the narrative of a tragic accident. unaware that the Rideau Canal was about to give up its dead, and that the fragments left on the pier would tell the truth he tried so hard to submerge. The sun rose over the historic skyline of Kingston on June 30th, 2009, with a deceptive, golden calm that masked the horror resting just below the surface of the Rideau Canal. At approximately 7 a.m., Mohammed Shafia walked into the Kingston police station with a practiced expression of frustration and bewilderment. He was a man playing a role, the weary patriarch of a large family whose rebellious children had finally pushed things too far. He reported that his 3 daughters, Zainab, Sahar, and Giti, along with his cousin Rona, had taken the silver Nissan Sentra while the rest of the family slept and had not returned. He spun a tale of a joyride gone wrong, suggesting that the girls, infatuated with their newfound Western freedoms, had likely gotten lost or were hiding out of spite. While Mohammed was crafting his narrative for the officers, the Rideau Canal was beginning to reveal its secrets. A worker at the Kingston Mills locks noticed a strange shimmering on the water's surface, a rainbow of oil and gasoline that didn't belong in the pristine channel. Peering through the murky green depths, he spotted a metallic glint, the dull silver roof of a car resting upside down on the canal bed. He immediately called for emergency services, unaware that he had just uncovered a watery tomb. When the police and rescue divers arrived, the atmosphere at the locks was one of grim anticipation. Divers entered the stagnant cold water and confirmed that a vehicle was indeed submerged, its cabin filled with the silt and darkness of the canal. As the heavy tow truck slowly hoisted the silver Nissan from the depths, the weight of the tragedy became physical. Water cascaded from the shattered frame, and the stench of canal mud filled the air. Through the glass, the rescuers saw a sight that would haunt them for years: the silhouettes of 4 women huddled together as if for warmth in their final, terrifying moments. Zainab was in the driver's seat. Sahar and Giti were in the back. Rona, the woman who had spent decades as a secret wife and domestic servant, sat beside the eldest daughter. They looked as if they were sleeping, their faces pale and serene in the morning light, but the autopsy would later confirm a more violent reality. They had been strangled before the car was dumped, or they had drowned in a pitch-black, locked cabin from which there was no escape. Mohammed and his second wife, Tuba, were brought to the scene, and their reaction was noted by every officer present. There was no wailing, no collapse of grief, no frantic demands for justice. Tuba looked away with a chilling detachment. Mohammed looked at the car, the vehicle that now held his 3 dead children, with a calculated expression of annoyance, as if his property had been damaged by their carelessness. But the search was just beginning. The investigators weren't looking at a simple drowning. They were looking at a crime scene. On the concrete pier, just feet from where the car had plunged into the basin, they found the fragments. Small, jagged pieces of black plastic lay scattered on the ground. When they turned their attention to the Shafia family's black Lexus SUV, the accident theory dissolved into a murder investigation. The Lexus had fresh damage to its front end, and the plastic fragments from the pier fit into the SUV's broken headlight assembly with 100% forensic certainty. The search for the missing women had ended in a morgue, but the hunt for the truth was now a high-stakes investigation into a conspiracy of honor. Detectives began to dig into the family's history, the calls to women's shelters, the reports of physical abuse, and the secret diary of a wife who knew she was living with her executioners. The canal had given up the bodies, and now the forensic evidence was about to give up the killers who thought they could submerge their shame forever. As the 4 bodies were transported to the morgue, the Kingston Police Department began the painstaking task of dismantling the Shafia family's elaborate facade of a tragic accident. Detective Sergeant Chris Scott and his team knew that in cases this calculated, the devil is in the details, the microscopic evidence and the digital footprints that the perpetrators think they've erased. The initial forensic examination of the silver Nissan Sentra provided the first major breakthrough. The damage to the rear bumper was not caused by hitting the water. It was a crushing, mechanical impact, the kind made by a heavy vehicle pushing a smaller one from behind with lethal intent. When investigators inspected the family's black Lexus SUV, the evidence became insurmountable. The damage on the SUV's front end was a perfect mirror to the damage on the Nissan's rear. The plastic fragments recovered from the pier at the Kingston Mills locks weren't just similar. They were a forensic match to the Lexus's grille and headlight assembly. This meant the Lexus hadn't just been nearby. It had been the physical engine of the crime, used to shove the girls and Rona over the precipice and into the abyss. But proving a conspiracy for murder, especially one masked as an honor killing, required understanding the psychological landscape of the Shafia home. Detectives initiated a series of interrogations, bringing in Mohammed, Tuba, and their eldest son, Hamed, separately. While Mohammed played the role of the grieving, traditional father for the cameras, his words in the privacy of the interrogation room and over the wiretaps told a much darker story. In recordings captured after the murders, Mohammed's voice was filled with a simmering, self-righteous rage. He was caught on tape referring to his own dead daughters as prostitutes and filth who had brought a terminal shame upon his name. He didn't speak of them with the hollow ache of loss. He spoke of them as property that had been successfully discarded. He was recorded telling Hamed, "May the devil shit on their graves," and insisting that even if he had to do it 100 times, he would clean his house of their westernized rebellion. The digital investigation, led by specialists in data recovery, provided the smoking gun of premeditation. On a computer used by Hamed, technicians found a history of searches that served as a blueprint for the execution. Weeks before the family vacation to Niagara Falls, someone had searched for "where to drown a car in Ontario" and "is it possible to commit a murder and not get caught?" They had even used Google Maps to zoom in on the remote Kingston Mills locks, scouting the exact spot where the concrete met the deep channel of the canal. The investigators also looked into the cellular data. On the night of June 30th, the family claimed they were all asleep in their motel rooms. But GPS pings and tower data told a different story. The phones belonging to Mohammed and Hamed were active at the locks at 2 a.m., the precise moment the Nissan was pushed into the water. As detectives reached out to the girls' schools and social services in Montreal, the full tragedy of missed opportunities came to light. Sahar had been seen with bruises. Gidi had begged her teachers to be placed in foster care, crying that her family was going to kill her. Zainab had spent weeks in a women's shelter, fleeing the prison of her home. The system had noted these red flags, but Mohammed's wealth and his ability to manipulate the narrative of cultural tradition had allowed him to keep his victims within reach. Perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence was the diary of Rona Amir Mohammed, the secret first wife. In its pages, she described a life of hell, characterized by systematic physical and verbal abuse from both Mohammed and Tuba. She knew she was in danger. She had become the girl's only protector, and in the end, she was deemed just as disposable as the daughters she tried to shield. By the end of July 2009, the weight of the fragments, the digital footprints, and the wiretapped confessions led to the arrest of the father, the mother, and the son. The investigation had revealed that in the Shafia house, honor was just another word for murder. The Crown's case was anchored by a mountain of forensic and digital evidence that left no room for doubt. Collision reconstruction experts testified with clinical, devastating precision, explaining that the silver Nissan Sentra didn't simply roll into the basin due to a driver's error. The damage to the rear bumper was a clear signature of a heavy, low-speed push from a much larger, more powerful vehicle, specifically the family's black Lexus SUV. This was supported by the discovery of matching plastic fragments at the canal pier, which fit into the Lexus's broken headlight assembly like pieces of a macabre jigsaw puzzle. The physical evidence told a story of a predatory hunt. one car forcing another toward the lip of a dark, 15-foot drop. But the most devastating evidence wasn't found in car parts or tire tracks. It was found in the voices of the accused. The jury was forced to listen to hours of wiretap recordings captured by the Kingston police in the weeks following the murders. In these recordings, Mohammed Shafia's voice was filled not with the hollow ache of a grieving father, but with a terrifying, self-righteous rage that chilled everyone in the gallery. He was heard calling his deceased daughters filth, traitors, and prostitutes. He told his son, "May the devil shit on their graves." For Mohammed, the deaths were a necessary act of cleansing to restore the family's honor. He spoke of the murders as a religious and cultural obligation, stating that even if they were to bring the girls back to life 100 times, he would do it all over again. Because to him, they were no longer his children. They were stains on his reputation. Tuba Yahya's testimony provided a different kind of horror. On the stand, she was a woman of constant contradictions, at times weeping and playing the role of the victim, at others offering cold, inconsistent explanations for the events of June 30. The prosecution systematically exposed her lies, highlighting how her story changed every time she was presented with a new piece of forensic evidence. She claimed she didn't know how the car ended up in the water, but the digital evidence showed her cell phone was active and pinging near the locks during the exact window of the drowning. She had stood by while her daughters were pushed into the dark. The defense attempted to frame the case as a tragic accident, arguing that Zainab had been behind the wheel and had accidentally driven over the edge during a late-night joyride. They claimed the damage to the Lexus happened elsewhere, and that the wiretapped rants were merely the expressions of a frustrated, traditional father, not a confession of murder. But the jury didn't buy it. The digital footprint was too clear. The premeditated searches for where to drown a car and the Google Maps tracking of the Kingston Mills locks weeks before the vacation began were the final nails in the coffin. On January 29, 2012, the jury reached their decision. The air in the courtroom was electric as the foreman stood up. Guilty. The word was repeated 12 times, 4 counts of first-degree murder for each of the 3 defendants. Mohammed and Hamed sat stone-faced, while Tuba began to wail, though many in the gallery noted the lack of actual tears. Judge Robert Moranger, in his final sentencing remarks, delivered a blistering condemnation that echoed across the country. He looked directly at the 3 killers and said, "It is difficult to conceive of a more despicable, more heinous, more honorless crime. The apparent reason for these cold-blooded, shameful murders was that the 4 innocent victims offended your twisted notion of honor that has no place in any civilized society. They were sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Even as they were led away, Mohammed Shafia remained defiant, shouting in the courtroom that he was a victim of a conspiracy and that the trial was an insult to his faith. He had sacrificed his family for a legacy that was now defined only by his own cruelty. The Rideau Canal remains a place of quiet, historic beauty, a ribbon of water that winds through the heart of Ontario, mirroring the changing seasons and the passage of time. But for those who know the story of the silver Nissan Sentra, the water will always hold a chill that has nothing to do with the winter frost. The case of the Shafia family didn't just end with a gavel hitting a block in a Kingston courtroom. It sent shockwaves through the collective consciousness of a nation, forcing a painful reckoning with the shadows that can hide behind the facade of a perfect immigrant success story. Zainab, Sahar, and Giti were not just names on a police report, and they certainly weren't the stains their father described. They were vibrant, living dreams of a better life. Girls who were willing to trade their comfort and their safety for the simple human right to breathe a little more freely. They wanted to wear the clothes they chose, to love the people they wanted, and to study for a future they owned. They were teenagers who sought to bridge 2 worlds, only to be crushed by the narrow, violent gate of their father's pride. And Rona, the woman whose life was spent in a silent, systematic life of hell, became the ultimate symbol of the cost of that silence. She was the girl's only protector, and she died as she lived, trying to hold back a storm she didn't create. In the years since the trial, the sprawling house in Montreal was emptied of its tension and its terror. The marble floors no longer echo with Mohammed's rants, and the walls no longer bear witness to the fear of 3 young girls. The 3 remaining children, the survivors of this patriarchal war, were taken into the care of the state, their names changed and their identities hidden to protect them from the toxic legacy of their own kin. They are the living ghosts of a dynasty that was built on mercantile success but collapsed under the weight of a monstrous ego. Mohammed Shafia sought to preserve his honor by erasing his daughters, but in his pursuit of purity, he achieved the exact opposite. He didn't cleanse his name. He stained it with an indelible mark of cowardice. His name is now a footnote in the history of Canadian crime, a warning about the lethality of a pride that views human beings as property. The daughters he called filth are the ones now remembered with dignity and light, while he, Tuba, and Hamid rot in separate cells, their honor a hollow echo in a cramped prison. We are left with the image of the Kingston Mills locks, the stillness of the water, the rustle of the trees, and the memory of 4 women who simply wanted to choose their own paths. True honor isn't found in blood, reputation, or the control of others. It is found in the freedom to live, the right to love, and the strength to protect those who trust us. The Shafia sisters deserved a life as wide and as deep as the country they called home. Instead, they were given the bottom of a canal. But the water didn't hide them. It brought them home, and it brought the truth to light. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.